Fortress in Malbork. A red colossus that shouldn't exist. There are places you look at and there are places who are watching you. Malbork belongs to the second category. Imagine a morning on the Nogat River. The fog lies low, as if someone had spilled milk over the water and the fields. The boundaries disappear, the sounds become soft, the river breathes slowly, and you are walking towards something that cannot be seen yet, but that you can already feel in the air. Like a burden, like a shadow. And then, from this greyness, a solid begins to emerge. First a fragment of the wall, then the tower. Then more walls, arcades, corners, a red mass that doesn't look like a building. It looks like a device, like a mechanism running in the landscape. The first thought is not what a beautiful castle. My first thought is who really built it. Because the scale of Malbork is inhuman. Not in a horror sense, but in a logical sense. This is not one castle, one stronghold, one wall. It is a system, layers, zones, transitions, system. The whole thing seems to have been designed in one mind, from start to finish. And this is the moment when official history usually takes a step forward and says Teutonic Knights. Order. Knight monks. The 13th century. Mission. Monastic state. Power. For many this is enough. For many, this is the whole answer. It's just that the longer you look at Malbork, the more you feel that this answer is too easy. Too smooth. Too comfortable. Because if it was one of the greatest investments of its era, where is the documentation? Where are the plans? Where are the sketches? Where are the workers' lists? Where are the settlements? Where are the names of the master builders? Medieval monks could write down everything. Every liturgy. Every meal. Every entrance and exit from the walls. Little things. Details. Dates. Names. And about building the largest brick colossus on the Baltic Sea? Silence. Silence is not evidence, but it is a signal. And sometimes the signal speaks louder than the news. One name appears in the sources. Like a shadow. Like a patch glued to the void. Master Johann. Except this name is like a signature on a painting no one has seen. No face. No documents with a stamp. No grave. Not sure if it was even a person or just a word someone tried to cover the gap with. And then the first hypothesis appears, which some people instinctively run away from because it sounds too strange. But in this story we won't run away from strange things. We will weigh them. The hypothesis goes like this. Maybe the Teutonic Knights didn't build Malbork. Maybe they took it over. Maybe they exposed it. Maybe they cleaned it up. Maybe they fixed it. Maybe they called it their own. Imagine layers of silt and clay from some ancient disaster. After great water, after a series of floods, after a period that is talked about in generalities. Neglect, fall, destruction. The earth can cover things faster than we think. All you need is time, water, and silence. Now imagine that you come to Nogat and find something that is already there. Something huge, buried, but legible. Then you don't need plans. You don't need the architect's name. Because you don't design, you extract. This hypothesis is like a splinter. It doesn't leave me alone. Because once you let it in, Malbork starts to look different. You begin to notice that this is not a building from the ancient times, but a building that imposed its rhythm on the era. Look at the brick. Not like a tourist. Like someone looking for traces of production. Brick is not magic. The brick has to be made. We need to find a cop. It needs to be extracted. It needs to be moved. It needs to be shaped. It needs to be dried. It needs to be burned out. She needs to be transported. It needs to be arranged. And there are few bricks in Malbork. There are so many bricks in Malbork that logistics itself is beginning to resemble a modern infrastructure project. And here comes the second, very difficult problem. Traces. Where are the remains of the huge furnaces? Where are the ash layers? Where are the millions of rejects defective elements that are always created in mass production? Where are the traces of fuel dumps, because burning bricks eats wood like fire, who knows no mercy? Of course, one could say, it has not been preserved. Of course you could say, destroyed. Of course, one could say that it was covered by later construction. Okay. But did they all die? All traces of this project are gone, and there are others? Has the name of the man who designed the largest brick complex on Earth disappeared? This is the gap that rings louder than 1,000 pages of chronicles. And now, so that we don't fall into the trap of a dark story without specifics, let's do the honest thing. Let's see what Malbork says about itself, because there are places where you don't need legends. Just look. Look at the lump in the fog. She's not chaotic. She's put together. As if someone was taking elements and combining them in a predictable way. As if it were a modular structure. As if there was a standard. And the standard in the Middle Ages, on such a scale, is not the default. The standard requires inspection. And here we enter the first part of this story. Malbork as a project, not a castle. Because when someone says fortress, you think of walls and war. And Malbork is also about logistics, production, storage, space control, zone separation, hidden corridors, and solutions that look like they were designed for more than one battle, only for continuous operation. And now a promise that I will keep in the next parts. I will tell you about Malbork as if we were investigators, not tourists. We will take one element at a time. And ask one question each time. Does this match the official version? And if it doesn't fit, what does it fit? But before we go deeper, we need to determine what we actually know about those who supposedly built it. The Teutonic Order was not a group of random knights. It was an organization, a network, a system, people who not only fought, but managed, they planned, built and maintained the apparatus of power. And this is important because it's easy to say they were capable. Of course they were. The problem is elsewhere. The problem is, why did they act as if they had come to a place they already knew? Because there is obviously no ideal construction point above the Nogat. Wetlands. Water. The land that needs to be tamed. Yet they chose a specific point and acted with determination, as if someone had told them here. And this is where the second level of the puzzle begins. Because maybe the key isn't in it at all. Could the Teutonic Knights have built Malbork? Maybe the key is why they built it exactly there. And why it looks like it's more than just a fortress. In the next part, we'll get into the middle of this mechanism and I'll show you three things. An element that looks like an ordinary detail, and in fact it reveals engineering thinking ahead of its time, a trace of work organization that resembles a production system more than medieval improvisation, and one thing, a place where Malbork ceases to be a castle. A lock, and it starts to look like an object with a different purpose. For now, I leave you with one image. The fog over the Nogat and the red lump that slowly emerges like it wasn't built. Only running. And a question that will come back like a refrain. If it really was just a fortress, why is it designed like a mechanism? We return to the bottom, because there it is easiest to feel that Malbork is not a castle from a postcard, but a burden placed on the water. The river looks calm, but it is the water that is the first architect here. It washes away and carries away the silt, it changes shores, retreats and returns, and man can only try to tame it. And now imagine that someone decides to build the largest brick structure in the world right here. In capricious, muddy terrain, difficult to predict. This is not the decision of a romantic or a knight who wants to have a nice view from the window. This is the decision of the engineer who counts flows, soil, weight, stability, logistics and time. Because Malbork couldn't be built after hours, it couldn't grow like a country cottage that gets new beams from year to year. Everything had to work like one machine here. Let's start with a brick, but not like tourists, but like investigators who take physical evidence in their hands. Brick is not a material given by fate. A brick is a product. And the product requires standard, repeatability and quality control. Otherwise the whole thing will start to crack like a bad tooth in winter. If the scale of Malbork is so large, the scale of production must have been huge. And huge production always leaves a trace in the ground, in ash, in waste, in piles, in ashes, in scattered remains of what could not be used. And when you ask about these traces, the answers are strangely soft, as if someone wanted to convince you that such a major operation could disappear unnoticed, like breathing on a mirror. This is the first moment when you get chills, because history is like a room. When someone takes something out of it, there is an empty space and you feel that something is missing, even if you don't know what yet. In the case of Malbork, this empty space is documentation. In a normal world, someone like a master builder does not disappear without a name, especially when behind his back there is a power that counts, records, lists and archives almost everything. And here you have silence for the first centuries of the fortress's existence. No architectural plans, no lists of workers, no bills for materials, no sketches, no name to grasp like anchors. Only later does a laconic mention appear, cold as a seal. The castle was built by a monastery. No details, no process, without stories about construction, as if it was not the work of people, but a fact of nature. And then out of this fog emerges the only name, which is supposed to pretend to be an answer. Master Johann. Only this name is like a signature under a painting that no one has seen. There is no face, there is no grave, there is no image, there is no continuity of sources, there is nothing that would allow us to say, yes, it is him, he is more of an administrative legend than a man. And if this is a legend, why was it included at all? Because it is inserted when the hole is too big to leave it empty. Malbork is starting to look like a project where someone really wants you to see the result, but doesn't want you to see the process. And when the trial disappears, suspicion appears and acts as a hook. Maybe the process wasn't what they tell us. Maybe there was no construction from scratch. Maybe there was a takeover, cleansing, reconstruction, adaptation, and then attribution to those who took over the key. And now we're getting into something which sounds like heresy, but in this story it is simply a working hypothesis. Malbork as an older object and the Order as a user. Notice how many things suddenly start to fit when you look at the fortress as a machine that can be turned on, off, repair and sign with a new plate. The lack of plans is no longer surprising, because plans are not made for something that is already in place. At most, sketches of repairs are made, and they disappear most easily. The lack of a heroic story about the construction is no longer surprising, because no one writes an epic about clearing the rubble. Epics are written about creation. And if there was no creation, there is nothing to write about. And the name of the master, Johanna, ceases to be an architect and begins to be a cover, a sort of master who can be invoked when a discussion needs to be closed. Now look at Malbork even differently. Not from the side of the walls, but from the side of the organization. The Teutonic Order was a network, not just an army. And this is a fact that I often don't feel, because in movies you see armor, not account books. It was administration, trade, connections, contacts with ports, with merchants, with guilds, with the system, which wrapped around Northern Europe like a spider's web. And the network thinks differently than the knight. The network thinks in terms of nodes, routes, range, logistics and flow control. And here comes the second big twist. Malbork stops looking like a ruler's fortress and starts to look like a node of the system. There is a chain of similar brick strongholds along the Baltic Sea. And the similarities are too consistent to blame them on coincidence or just fashion. This doesn't look like a situation where everyone builds in their own way with what they have. It looks like a situation where someone imposes a standard, and the standard means headquarters, plan, control, and sometimes something else. One idea that is bigger than a single castle. Imagine a map at night. Dark coast and points on the horizon. Towers on which you can light a fire. Give a signal, convey a message, warn. Start the chain of reactions. If these objects are arranged like relays, you no longer ask who built this one fortress, you're just asking who put together the system. Because the system requires a view from above, or knowledge passed on like a secret. It requires measurement, experience, and sometimes it requires something that sounds disturbing. A long-term plan that outlives people. And this is where the emotion comes in, because you start to understand that this is not a story about walls, but about power that likes to be invisible. Power that doesn't have to shout, because it works through infrastructure, through warehouses, through route control, through logistics, through transfer possibilities, through the flow of goods and information. And Malbork is an ideal place for such an inspection, because it is located near the water and stands on the water, and water was the highway back then. Whoever controls the river controls trade, and whoever controls trade controls the people, and he doesn't even need war to win. That's why Malbork gives the impression as if it was designed not only to defend, but to function, to last, to manage and to withstand pressure for years. Notice how they claim divide space, how it creates zones, how it leads people through corridors, how it closes, how it filters, how it allows one to pass and not the other. It's not just a castle, it is a control tool, and in this sense it is surprisingly modern. And now, in order not to go into the same atmosphere, let's take another hard element, technique. In the Middle Ages, great things were built, but they were often built in a way that betrayed the boundaries of the era. Curves, compromises, patching, changes in plan, corrections in progress, traces of struggle with the material. Malbork has something that looks like a lack of struggle, like the implementation of a project that does not have to learn from mistakes, because it was as if he already knew them. And when you see it, it kind of gives you another chill, because it's kind of a place in history where the biggest questions arise. And then we return to the underground, because the truth about old buildings often lies where the light from the tourist brochure cannot reach. You go lower, you feel the cold, humidity, the air thickens, the sound of footsteps changes, as if you had entered another world. A world where walls are not decoration, just a layer. Underneath such objects there are often traces of earlier stages, older structures, reconstructions, things that say it didn't start here. And that's why people who seek the truth always want to go deeper. Because on the surface you see the end result, and underneath you see the story, like a cross-section through the earth. And in Malbork there are elements that can look as if they belong to another story. Layers that seem older, pieces that don't fit into a simple sentence, it was built then and there. Details that look as if someone was using rules that weren't officially in use yet. Of course, you can always say these are just earlier fortifications, these are just foundations from something made of wood, these are just later repairs. But these sentences sometimes sound like a lullaby meant to lull you to sleep before you ask something more uncomfortable. Because wood doesn't explain stone, and chance does not explain the consequences. And here comes the thread, which is like dark water under the ice. The Great Reset. There are stories, there are accounts, there are images and representations that can suggest that the fortress was once lower, as if the earth was holding her. As if the courtyards were filled with dirt. As if the levels we now call underground were once a normal level of life. You can dismiss it as the artist's imagination, but you can also ask where the artist got this intuition. Because silt and clay do not appear from neglect alone. Silt and clay come with water, and there are waters that do not ask for permission, they just enter, leave a layer and go away. And after them there is silence. If such a moment in history ever happened, then reconstruction looks different, because then no, you rebuild from nothing, you just dig it out, you reveal, restore, use what has survived and write it into a new narrative. And then the question comes back, sharper than all the previous ones. If the order found something, how did it know that he should look there? Why does it seem as if they are not wandering, as if they are not testing, as if they came for something specific, as if someone had guided them, or as if they had a map that shouldn't be allowed to be had? This is the moment when you feel that this history is not just about bricks, but about knowledge that changes hands, changes owners, changes flags, but does not disappear. And if this is the case, then Malbork is not a Teutonic castle, but an object that the Teutonic Knights connected to their network, just as today an old power plant is connected to modern infrastructure. It works because someone knows how to make it work. This is where I have to make a promise, because in a podcast, promises are like anchors. In the next part we will go into detail which people hungry for mystery like it the most. We will enter into signs, into repetitive motifs, in symbols that in Malbork do not look like decorations, but like instructions, like a signature, like something to be recognized by those who know where to look. And then we will take a step further, the most dangerous step of this story. We will check whether these signs appear only here or are repeated throughout the entire network of objects, which look like relays. Because if they are repeated, it means that someone speaks to us in one language, only through brick and stone, not through paper. And paper can be burned, paper can be hidden, paper can be recycled, but the brick stands there waiting for someone to read it like a message. And when you realize that Malbork may be news, it becomes really difficult to fall asleep, because then the question is, who built it turns into a question of who left it here and why. And that's where the third part begins, because it leads to the conclusion which for some will be blasphemy, and for others, a revelation. That history is not always a record of what happened, but a record of what was allowed to be written. Before we ask the last question, let's do something simple. Let's stop looking at Malbork as a building and start looking at it as a text, because stone and brick can also speak, just not with letters, but with signs. And if someone really wanted to hide the truth, then he wouldn't leave it on paper that could be burned, but in a wall, which cannot be easily invalidated. That's why we now enter the most dangerous part of this story. In symbols that look like decorations, and they behave like a signature. Let's start with the themes that people pass by every day without asking questions. Creatures, figures, signs in stone, which are there because they always have been. However, if you look at them like an investigator, you will notice something strange. Certain motifs return stubbornly, as if someone didn't decorate, but just signified. Some people draw attention to the representations of griffins that can be found in various places in the complex and the surrounding area and ask, why him? Why so often? Why at points that look like important route junctions? In many ancient cultures, the griffin was a guard of the passage, a symbol of protection, a symbol of the boundary between what is open and what is hidden. I'm not saying it's proof. I say it's a question that keeps coming back when a person looks more carefully than a tourist. The second clue is the orientation signs, such compass systems, roses of directions, symmetry motifs that are more suited to a man of navigation and measurement than to a man of prayer. Why, in a place that was officially a monastic and administrative center, hide signs in the floors and details? Which sounds like the language of directions, distances, and maps, because if you are building a network, rather than one object, this orientation becomes a more practical religion than any theology. And the third thing is the most disturbing because it affects the structure itself. Inverted arcs and illogical solutions that look like an intentional gesture rather than a mistake. Every builder intuitively feels how the weight should work, and yet in some places you can hit something which looks like a conscious violation of intuition. And this is the moment when decoration ceases to be decoration and starts to be a sign. Stop, look, this is not a coincidence. The most electrifying thing about this story is not that the signs exist, but that they form a logic when you stop looking at them. Malbork as a lonely island. Because Malbork starts working only when you treat it like a knot, not a palace. Then you ask not about what you see in the photos, only what you see on the map and in the flood, in the water, on the road, in the signal. Imagine a night by the coast and rivers. There's no electricity, there's no radio, he doesn't have a phone, and yet the information can run faster than a horse if you have vantage points and know the rhythm. Fire on the tower. Answer on the next one. And another one. A chain that acts like a nerve in the body. If these buildings really formed the backbone of control, then Malbork ceases to be a fortress and becomes the center that manages the traffic and security of the entire zone. And then we come back to the question that hurts the most. Why does the story tell the story so simply when the geometry of the object itself is so complex? Why do we label the lock so easily when the whole thing behaves like a space control device? Notice how Malbork leads the man. How it separates zones. How it forces directions. How it creates throats, gates, passages, places where the crowd turns into a queue and the queue turns into control. This is not just a defense against an external enemy. This is a defense against the chaos within. This is a project that anticipates people. And here we come to a thread that is more emotional and symbolic. To a trace that looks like a human voice from the past. There is a story about the scribe's notes from the time of the order. A more personal text than the official chronicle, where among the ordinary notes there was a phrase that sounds like a break in the official narrative that they do not build, but awaken. Even if you treat it carefully, even if you think it's a legend, see how brilliantly it fits what you feel when you stand under the walls. Because Malbork really doesn't look like anything what was created from scratch with mud and sweat. It looks like something that has been triggered. Like a mechanism for which someone found the instructions. And then this darkest possibility arises. That the law took its place which already had a history, and their role was to take over and administer. That there may have been older layers underneath, and what we admire today is part reconstruction, part overlay, part mask. Notice how the theme of silence comes back again and again in this story. No plans, no names, quick explanations, limited access. And one decision that always appears in the background in old stories, silence was ordered. This is the psychology of power. Power loves two estates. Pride and silence. He shows pride to people. He leaves silence for secrets. If you discover something what you don't understand, but what gives you an advantage, is you don't organize a conference. You close the door, put the seal, and change the narrative so that people see what needs to be seen. At this point you have to say something out loud, which is like cold water on the back of your neck. Even if Malbork was entirely the work of the Order, the very logic of its design reveals an obsession with survival. This is not architecture for a moment. This is architecture that thinks about crisis as if it were something certain. About hunger. About the siege. About blocking the roads. About cutting off supplies. About isolation. About how the world outside can fall apart and order must continue to operate inside. And now we're back to your shiver because it is a very human thrill. What did they really predict? Before, what is an object built, which looks like a fortress against disaster and not just against the army? If this story really involves the shadow of great water, great mud, great burying, then Malbork could have been something more than a castle. It could have been an infrastructure shelter, inventory node, control point. Or maybe even a kind of civilization fuse, meant to survive when the rest disappears. And then the symbols cease to be decorations and become like signs on emergency doors. Here is the passage, here is the direction, here is the key. That's why these motifs tempt the imagination so much, because they promise that the castle is a map. And the thing about maps is that they guide. You just need to know how to read them, so let's read further, even deeper. In functions that are too practical, that they were just decorations of the era. Ventilation, circulation, internal roads, solutions that look like designing comfort and continuity of action, not improvising in fear. This is a feature of a building created by people who think systemically. They don't build walls, they only build functioning. And this functioning is one big key word. Logistics. If Malbork was the heart of the system, it had to have the ability to receive, store and send. Movement, food, people, information. And suddenly you understand why the river is so important here. The river is not a background. The river is a conduit. It is a road that does not need cobblestones. It's a route you can smuggle anything along if you have control of the banks. And then an idea is born that is the most engaging because it touches on contemporary times. Whoever controls the infrastructure does not have to control each person individually. It is enough that it controls the nodes. And Malbork looks like a junction designed to be impassable. And here is the moment for the most important question of the entire series. The question is bigger than who. Why was something like this built? If it was just a fortress, this is an exaggeration. If it was just a monastery, it's absurd. If it was just a center of power, this is still more than enough. So 3 answers emerge, each more disturbing than the last. First one. It was done because a long war was expected and they wanted to have a heart, which cannot be broken away. Second. This was done because a network of trade and information control was being created, and the castle was the key to traffic throughout the region. Third. It was done because someone remembered the disaster and built it not for war, just to reset the world. And now you can choose which answer sounds most normal. Only Malbork doesn't sound normal. Malbork sounds like a memory of something bigger. That's why at the end I leave you with not one thesis, but one scene. Imagine the silence at night, when the courtyards are empty and the wind passes through the cloisters like a breath. Then it's easier to believe that this place is not just a stone. That this is the device waiting. And that its true function was not then, but always is. Because mechanisms are built to work in any era. So if Malbork is news, it sounds something like this. Don't trust paper, look at the walls, because walls don't lie so easily. And if the walls don't lie, the trouble is that they say things we don't want to hear. And now the last question that leaves me like a splinter. If this is all a network, if this is a system, if this is a mechanism, so where is the rest of him? If Malbork is a node, then there must be a network that we cannot see because we are looking too close. Maybe part of this network still stands today, we just call it a ruin, a church, a granary, an old fort and don't connect the dots. Maybe some of it was demolished, because the authorities always dismantle everything that could reveal the plan. Or maybe the most important elements are underground, covered with mud, as if someone he wanted them to survive, but he didn't want them to, that we find them too quickly. And this is the strangest thing in Malbork. The more you think about it, the less it looks like a castle from history and more like a device from the world's memory. So if you ever come here and stand on the Nougat in the fog, just don't ask who built it. Ask who started it and why we should see it now. Do you want me to make an alternative version of the finale, more aggressive, conspiratorial and more emotional, but still believable in the narrative? Do you prefer the quiet, mysterious one,